From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. First, the headlines. New Year, new Hamtramck. City swears in first Muslim mayor, all-Muslim council. Muslims face a suicide crisis in America. 1 million new COVID infections recorded in USA on Monday. Muslim women being auctioned online in India. Muslims concerned as France takes over EU presidency. Our top story tonight. Hamtramck made history Sunday when Amir Ghalib became the Michigan city's first Muslim mayor. Ghalib was sworn in alongside 3 new council members who are also Muslim. Adam Al-Barmaki, Amanda Jakowski, and Khalil Rifai were newly elected to the council seats. The city of 28,000 might be the first in the nation to have an all-Muslim council and mayor. Hamtramck was a largely Polish enclave in the 20th century. It is now home to many Middle Eastern and South Asian immigrants. Hamtramck's city manager Kathleen Angerer said during Sunday's ceremony that there is nothing more American than immigrant families venturing into local politics. While stigma around mental illness in Muslim communities is strong, culturally and religiously consistent resources are not easily accessible. That's according to a recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry. In the U.S., the study shows American Muslims are twice as likely as any other religious group to report previous suicide attempts. It also found that experiencing discrimination, especially that which is Islamophobic and gender-based, increased suicide attempts by 180%. The study was conducted through a partnership among Stanford MMHIP Lab, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and the Institute for Muslim Mental Health. Text SALAM to 741741 any day or time if you are struggling with mental health. The U.S. recorded over 1 million new COVID-19 infections yesterday. That was almost double the amount of just a few days ago. The nation broke records 4 times this week for its 7-day average of new daily cases. The number of children hospitalized with COVID-19 is soaring across the country as a highly transmissible Omicron variant spreads. Still, new studies support the claim that Omicron may be less dangerous than other variants. Over 200 candlelight vigils in nearly every state are planned for Thursday across the United States to mark the first anniversary of the January 6th attack in the U.S. Capitol. Some gatherings include voter registration drives and voter outreach events. These are aimed at counteracting efforts to restrict voting rights and attack fair voting districts. Last January, thousands of supporters of former President Donald Trump descended on the U.S. Capitol while lawmakers were certifying President Joe Biden's election victory. A Capitol police officer died after being beaten by Trump supporters. 4 others died as well. Ian Basson, co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, said this.
Republican state legislators have introduced more than 260 bills this year that would criminalize certain election worker activities, make it harder for people to vote, give partisan legislatures more power to remove and replace nonpartisan election administrators, and create more opportunities for disruption in the vote counting and vote certification process. 32 of those bills have passed in 17 states.
Media watchdogs are warning networks and journalists against uncritical coverage of Donald Trump's planned news conference ahead of the anniversary of the January 6th U.S. Capitol attack. Angelo Carusone, president of Media Matters for America, said Trump will use the opportunity to downplay the Capitol insurrection and set up his 2024 presidential campaign. Carusone stressed it is critical that news networks refuse live coverage to avoid promoting lies and disinformation. New York University journalism professor Jay Rosen, who writes and edits the blog PressThink, also urged against carrying Trump's speech live in a Sunday tweet. He said this would amplify the former president's go-to lies that have been debunked. A new poll shows 34% of Americans think violent action against the government is sometimes justified. The Washington Post and the University of Maryland released a survey days ahead of the first anniversary of the U.S. Capitol attack. Former polls by the Post or other major news organizations over more than 2 decades showed that percentage was much lower. The survey conducted between December 17th and 19th revealed stark partisan splits. It showed that 40% of Republicans and 41% of independents said violence against the government is sometimes justified, compared to 23% of Democrats. In a separate CBS News YouGov poll, 62% of Americans said they expect violence over losing in future presidential elections. A team of Afghan intelligence agents poured almost 800 gallons of liquor into a canal in Kabul, the spy agency said Sunday. Video footage released by the General Directorate of Intelligence shows its agents pouring alcohol stored in barrels into the canal after seizing it during a Capitol raid. A religious scholar in the video posted by the agency on Twitter on Sunday said Muslims must seriously abstain from making and delivering alcohol. 3 dealers were arrested during the operation. Taliban authorities are cracking down on the sale of alcohol. Selling and consuming liquor was banned even under the previous Western-backed regime of Ashraf Ghani. As France takes over the rotating European Union presidency for the next 6 months, critics are concerned its anti-Muslim sentiments could affect regional policies. Many European Muslims worry that France's divisive anti-Muslim political discourse could seep into EU policymaking. French President Emmanuel Macron could nudge Europe toward greater strategic autonomy in the world. Macron's decision to temporarily fly the blue and gold EU flag at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris has angered far-right and conservative candidates. Some leaders in Brussels worry hotly contested French presidential elections in April could affect France's EU presidency before a key conference on the future of Europe. Iranians on Monday marked the second anniversary of the killing of military commander Qasem Soleimani at the Grand Musalla Mosque in Tehran. Soleimani was killed by a U.S. drone strike outside Baghdad in January 2020. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and Soleimani's daughter Zainab Soleimani attended Monday's ceremony. Soleimani was among the most trusted and loyal lieutenants of Ayatollah Khamenei. Raisi called for worldly retribution for Soleimani's assassins, referencing former U.S. President Donald Trump and his military squad. In July 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings said the U.S. had not provided sufficient evidence to justify the attack on Soleimani and called it a violation of international law. A fake site, the second to pop up in months, is part of an online campaign to bully Muslim women in India with threats of sexual violence. Hiba Beg, a graduate student from the United States, was visiting the grave of her grandmother in New Delhi last weekend. Beg learned she was put up for sale to the highest bidder online for the second time in less than a year. Women featured in the auction included Fatima Nafis, the mother of a student activist who disappeared more than 5 years ago after a fight with a right-wing student group. Also featured were a film star turned social activist, a researcher, and several prominent Muslim women. Hindu Mankyati Narsinganand has said Muslim women are being used as sexual objects to spread the power of Islam. ISIS remains strong in Syria, contrary to the international coalition's claiming victory in March 2019. In its report, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights documented ISIS activities and operations last year. In 2021, the group reported the deaths of 880 people in security operations in the Syrian desert. ISIS is escalating operations carried out in areas under the control of the regime and the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, according to reports. The SDF and the international coalition have carried out counter-security operations, while regime forces continue routine combing campaigns with intensive airstrikes. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. We share news about the European Islamophobia Report 2020. Author of the report is joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. Islamophobia is rising in Europe because Europe thinks Islam is rising and they're fearful of it. In France, people were asked how many Muslims are there. They thought there are 31% Muslims in France, while there are only 8%. And Islamophobia is going to be probably claiming a whole lot of victims. Right now, France has shut down more than 76 mosques there. And now they're going to be, actually, they have already started chairing the European Union. To discuss Islamophobia in Europe, we had Farid Hafiz with us, who is a Georgetown University project of Bridges and also visiting professor of international studies. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
So tell us, what are the salient findings of this recent report of Islamophobia rising in Europe?
Well, we have been conducting the European Islamophobia report now for 6 years in consecutive years since 2015. And the basic aim of our report at the very beginning was, since there was such a big denial of the very existence of Islamophobia, to just bring the proof in order to also support anti-racist and Muslim civil society organizations, just to lobby for their interests in order to fight the discrimination that happens against them. So obviously a lot has changed throughout the last 6 years, and every year we see new trends occurring. And I would say, and that was also the reason why for the 2020 report, we chose the cover page to show Emmanuel Macron, the current Prime Minister of France. Why? Because he has become a champion of institutionalized Islamophobia. As you already mentioned before, several mosques were raided, and that all of that happened after the murder of the French history teacher back in autumn 2020, when the government used this incident basically to crack down on Muslim civil society, mosque organizations, anti-racist organizations, to make Muslim life difficult. If you ask me why are they doing this, what is the reason and the rationale behind that, I would say there are different takes on how to deal with Muslim presence in Europe. The far right has a very superficial perspective, and they just basically want to kick out the Muslims, which is not doable in a liberal democracy, right? Where you have citizenship, you can't just like expel people from your country. And so the governing political parties, they have to come up with a rational perspective of how to do that. So in my perspective, I think the reason behind these forms of institutionalized Islamophobia is basically because France, like so many other European countries, wants to create its own form of Islam, a nationalized, domesticated version of Islam, in order to be able to govern its Muslims, because the assumption is that the vast majority can be a security threat, and those who are organized are a security threat to them. And out of this logic, the implication is that they have to crack down on them. And this is what we are witnessing. So there is a securitization of Muslims going on, and the answer by the political regimes in power is to crack down on them in order to hold their power.
You use the term institutionalized Islamophobia. What do you mean by that?
Institutionalized Islamophobia for me is when state authorities use their power in order to restrict the religious freedom, the freedom of association, the freedom of speech for Muslim people. And this is exactly what we are witnessing, not only in France, but in several European countries. But I think France is really at the forefront, together with Austria, where I come from originally. So what we see here is like the state subsidizes institutions that have the sole purpose of criminalizing Muslims. In Austria in 2020, there was a center called the Documentation Center Political Islam established, which has the sole reason to monitor and surveil Muslim civil society, create reports about them in order to paint the picture of them being a security threat in one way or another. and that is one form of institutionalized Islamophobia. Institutionalized Islamophobia is also the numerous numbers of anti-Muslim legislation, like the ban of mosques, the ban of hijabs, the ban of minarets. All of these are forms how racism, anti-Muslim racism, here is being institutionalized by those governments and by consecutively also by the state authorities.
How do you think, how many countries have ban on hijab or halal or mosque or minarets?
Well, I mean, there are several countries where we have legislation and more countries where we have debates about it. There was a ban of the hijab, for instance, for elementary school in Austria, which was then lifted by the Constitutional Court because Muslims went to the court and sued the government. There are bans of the hijab in France. There was for a long time a ban of the hijab for teachers, for instance, in Germany. There is just a ban of the hijab was upheld by the European Court of for a Belgian case. So you have different legislation all around, and the idea is obviously, because sometimes I feel like people in North America, it's really hard to grasp how that can even happen. In Europe, you have very strong nation states, and the nation states intermingle a lot in religious affairs. So although there is this idea of separation between church and state, so-called secularism, the way secularism materializes in several European countries is just different to what we know, for instance, from the United States. And it's very near to what we have in the French parts of Canada, for instance, where there is more of a French notion of secularism.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't know whether you know it or not. Once, about 15 years ago, I think, I visited France, accompanied by a think tank in Chicago. And we met the minister, and they talked about everything. And then they sent us to meet an imam. They said he's the chair of the Muslim council of some sort in a very large, old, beautiful mosque. And after the conversation, he described what his council is. I asked, can I see your bylaws? He said, oh, bylaws are with the person who sent you towards me. I mean, the minister over there. So I was surprised and shocked to see a not-for-profit NGO was created, but essentially controlled by the government. When I asked that question, they say, well, we control Catholicism as well. Are they dealing with Catholicism and other religion the way they are dealing with Muslim community and Islam?
Well, I think the French case is very specific because most of the European countries are not like France. And in France, indeed, there is a very special case where you have the government really trying to interfere into religious issues of a lot of different denominations and churches. In other European countries, like, let's say, for instance, Austria or Germany or Belgium, there's a difference because governments and state authorities normally do not interfere and cannot interfere into religious affairs of the respective religious denominations or churches. Why? Because the idea of secularism, again, is the separation of state power and church power. But what we see when it comes to Muslims is that they do it with Muslims, but not through the window of religious affairs issues, but rather through the window of security threat and the Ministry of Interior. So you have what you will find in different European countries, like, let's say, the Italian, the German, or the Austrian Ministry of Interior. They try to define what is a good Islam and what is not. So they set up different institutions, similar to what you were just talking about in the French case, where again the Ministry of France, Interior Ministry of France, they set up this Muslim institution in order to be able to have an institution speaking for Muslims. But basically it was about controlling what the public image of Islam should look like in order to support government policies, right? They wanted this body to represent their interests and not self-organized Muslims. And that is, I think, also the reason why, for instance, in France, we had, again, not only mosques, but also anti-racist organizations being shut down by the Ministry of Interior. Why? Because they were speaking out against these forms of inequalities, discrimination, and state authoritarianism. And I think that is really what is at stake currently, and what a lot of Muslims also fear in a time when the French Prime Minister is also heading the EU presidency.
Do you think it is going to cause major problems in other countries because the French president is going to be head of the European Union? So do you see a worsening scenario?
Not necessarily on an EU level. I mean, we see that these attempts are existing anyway, be it if you are heading the EU presidency or not. Because France, Austria, and Denmark are definitely at the forefront of trying also to mobilize other EU member states to follow them in the way they are dealing with Muslims. But I do not see that they are necessarily having the power. But at the very same time, we see the French government, even before it had the EU presidency, it was trying to interfere into issues where Muslim civil society was cooperating with the European Commission. When there was this, for instance, this one campaign that was trying to empower Muslim women to be able to wear their hijab and not being discriminated against, the Ministry of Interior or the French government interfered, and then this whole campaign was stopped. So there are examples where the French government has already tried to have a say on a European level, and I think that will continue. The question is, how will be the reaction of the rest of the European Union? There are also signs that for a lot of European Union member states, this is not an acceptable way. We saw that in autumn 2020, after the murder of Samuel Paty. The French government, along the Germans and Austrians, wanted to draft a paper against terrorism, and they had numerous mentions of Islam in that paper. And there was a huge pushback from the other European countries, where they did not want to have this clash of civilizations talk, but rather have a reasonable statement against the murderous attack only.
So do you think then Germany will continue to go along with France at this moment in these type of drafting of European Union positions?
Well, the way I see it is that in the European Union, there are different forces when it comes to this issue. And I think Germany, it's difficult to say, because now we are seeing, on one hand, there is a new government in place. After 16 years of rule by the conservatives, we now have a more left-leaning and social democratic government. This is one thing. So that does not necessarily mean that a lot of the already existing institutionalized forms of Islamophobia will fade away, because that is deeply entrenched in the security apparatus in Germany. And there is a lot of problematic aspects. But at the very same time, Germany, I think, is also one of those countries where there is a lot of pushback also against Islamophobia. I think there are only few countries where there is also so much support for NGOs fighting Islamophobia. So it is something that we still will have to see how it plays out within the next few years.
When the European Union is being, going in this way, countries can push, but the moderating influence always comes from the court. But court, on the case of hijab, going against hijab, is it a major setback, or is some technical thing which could be corrected in future?
Well, generally speaking, the European Court tries not to have too much to say in terms of religious politics, and leaves it to the nation states. But nevertheless, there were some examples of decisions that came from European courts that were definitely not in support of anti-discrimination. And the problem is obviously because they very much rely on the national way how those nation states deal with religion. So the outcomes are always kind of different and are not linear in a way. That said, we can also see in different European nation states that when Muslims go to the court, again, the outcomes are very different. There are examples like the one I mentioned, where in Austria, where the Constitutional Court rescinded the hijab ban, and you also have examples where it's the opposite. So it always depends on various factors, and first and foremost on the way how religion, society, and church-state relationships are defined by those nation states.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Farid Hafiz, for your time. Professor Farid Hafiz is a leading scholar of research at the Georgetown University Bridge Initiative and a professor of international relations. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.